Some people think history belongs behind ropes and warning signs. Sometimes history is the man quietly reaching for the door. The morning air carried the scent of fresh-cut grass across the Veterans Memorial Park outside Billings, Montana, where families gathered beneath bright blue skies for the annual Military Heritage Celebration. Children pointed excitedly toward rows of restored military vehicles while veterans in faded service caps exchanged quiet handshakes that needed few words. At the center of the exhibition stood the unmistakable silhouette of a restored Bell UH-1 Huey helicopter, its olive drab paint glowing beneath the late summer sun. Volunteers had spent months preparing the aircraft, polishing every panel, cleaning every window, and placing respectful signs asking visitors not to climb aboard without authorization. The helicopter had become the centerpiece of the entire event. Long before noon, a steady line of visitors stretched across the display area, cameras clicking as grandparents explained its history to curious grandchildren. Standing near the entrance to the exhibit was Ethan Brooks, a 24-year-old volunteer coordinator wearing a neatly pressed event polo shirt, a name badge, and a bright smile that reflected genuine pride in helping organize the celebration. He had memorized every safety rule and repeated them with polite confidence throughout the morning. Protecting the restored helicopter had become his responsibility, and he intended to perform it perfectly. A few yards away, an elderly man walked slowly along the paved pathway with measured steps that revealed more patience than age. Jack Sullivan was 84 years old, his weathered olive field jacket resting naturally across his shoulders despite the warm weather. Time had softened the fabric until it almost blended with the faded shoulder patch sewn decades earlier. His white hair caught the morning sunlight, and his calm blue eyes remained fixed on the helicopter ahead. He carried no medals. He wore no special identification. To everyone around him, he appeared to be another quiet veteran enjoying the day's memorial activities. Yet every step toward the Huey felt strangely familiar, as though an invisible thread had gently guided him back across half a century. The distant sound of children laughing slowly disappeared from his thoughts. Instead, he noticed the shape of the landing skids, the curve of the cockpit windows, and the weathered metal step beneath the cabin door. His breathing became slower. A faint smile crossed his face as memories settled quietly beneath the surface without demanding attention. He stopped only inches from the helicopter and carefully raised one hand toward the worn doorway, not with excitement, but with unmistakable affection. Before his fingertips reached the metal frame, Ethan stepped forward with professional courtesy and lifted one hand. "I am sorry, sir," he said politely. "Visitors are not allowed to climb into the helicopter." Jack immediately lowered his hand and nodded once. "I understand," he answered in a calm voice. There was no disappointment in his expression, no frustration, and no attempt to explain himself. He simply took one small step backward. Nearby conversation slowed as several visitors glanced toward the exchange. One family paused beside the information display. A photographer instinctively lifted his camera and captured the brief moment without realizing why it felt important. Ethan offered an apologetic smile, believing he had simply prevented another well-meaning guest from ignoring the rules. "We have to preserve it for everyone," he added kindly. Jack looked at the young volunteer before turning his eyes back toward the Huey. "You are doing your job," he replied. His voice carried no trace of resentment. It held only quiet understanding. Then his gaze settled once more on the open cabin door, and for a single silent moment it seemed less like a museum exhibit than an old friend patiently waiting across the years. Jack Sullivan remained exactly where he had stepped back, his hands resting comfortably at his sides as the morning breeze carried the faint scent of pine through the memorial park. Around him, families continued moving from one display to another, their conversations slowly returning as the brief interruption faded into the rhythm of the event. Ethan Brooks offered another courteous smile before greeting the next visitors approaching the Huey. "Please stay behind the marked line unless one of our guides invites you forward," he said with practiced confidence. The words sounded warm, yet they also reminded Jack how much the world had changed. Once, that helicopter had represented uncertainty, duty, and hope. Today it stood quietly behind polished ropes, admired through cameras and information signs. Jack never blamed anyone for that. Time had a way of turning living memories into museum pieces. He slowly walked a few steps along the display, studying the aircraft from different angles. The fresh olive paint reflected the sunlight beautifully, yet his eyes seemed drawn to smaller details that few others noticed. He looked at the rivets surrounding the cabin door, the slight curve of the landing skids, the shape of the rotor mast, and the worn texture of the aluminum step beneath the entrance. His expression softened with every familiar detail. It was not admiration for a machine. It was recognition of something that had once carried enormous responsibility. Several feet away, an older visitor wearing a Vietnam veteran cap quietly watched Jack instead of the helicopter. The stranger noticed the way Jack tilted his head while studying the aircraft, almost as though he were reading a language only a handful of people still understood. Before he could approach, another group of children surrounded the display, filling the air with cheerful excitement. Ethan patiently answered questions about the helicopter's history, explaining how volunteers had restored it over several years with tremendous care. "We want future generations to appreciate what this aircraft represents," he said proudly. Jack nodded almost imperceptibly as he listened. "That is a worthy goal," he murmured to himself. A little girl pointed toward the open cabin and asked whether anyone had ever flown inside that particular helicopter. Ethan smiled. "According to the records we have, yes. Many years ago." The answer was simple, accurate, and incomplete all at once. Jack lowered his eyes for a moment before looking back toward the cockpit. The sunlight reflected across the windshield exactly as he remembered, and for the briefest instant it seemed as though the years separating then and now had quietly disappeared. His breathing slowed again. Nearby, the photographer who had captured the earlier encounter reviewed his images on the camera screen. One photograph immediately caught his attention. It showed Jack reaching toward the helicopter while Ethan gently stopped him. There was nothing dramatic about the picture, yet something inside it felt strangely powerful. The photographer frowned thoughtfully before lowering the camera again. He could not explain why that single image seemed different from hundreds of others he had taken that morning. As Jack continued standing silently beside the exhibit, another volunteer walked over to Ethan carrying a clipboard. "Everything going smoothly?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Very smoothly. We have had a great turnout. Just making sure everyone follows the rules." She smiled approvingly before continuing toward another display. Ethan glanced back toward Jack for only a second. The elderly veteran had not complained, had not argued, and had not tried to step closer again. He simply stood there looking at the helicopter with quiet patience that somehow made the young volunteer feel unexpectedly uneasy. Ethan could not explain the feeling. He had enforced the rules exactly as instructed, yet something about the older man's calm acceptance lingered in his thoughts. Neither of them realized that another pair of experienced eyes had just begun studying both the veteran and the helicopter with growing curiosity, noticing details that would soon transform an ordinary memorial event into a story no one present would ever forget. The elderly veteran remained near the display long after most visitors had moved toward the restored armored vehicles on the opposite side of the memorial park. Jack Sullivan never crossed the safety line again. Instead, he quietly observed the Huey from where he stood, almost as though distance itself had become a form of respect. The morning sun climbed higher, reflecting softly from the helicopter's broad windshield and polished fuselage. To hundreds of visitors it was an impressive historical exhibit. To Jack it felt unmistakably alive, carrying memories no restoration could ever erase. Across the display area, another visitor had not stopped watching him. Thomas Mercer, a 76-year-old retired Army helicopter pilot who had volunteered as a historical consultant for the event, narrowed his eyes with growing curiosity. He had spent years around restored aircraft, and he had seen countless veterans admire old helicopters with nostalgia. Yet something about Jack felt different. It was not simply recognition. It was familiarity born from experience. Thomas noticed the way Jack's eyes paused briefly on the transmission housing before moving naturally toward the rotor head, then down along the cabin frame to the landing skid. Most visitors admired the helicopter as a whole. Jack examined it piece by piece, instinctively following the exact sequence a pilot might use while approaching an aircraft before flight. Thomas quietly stepped closer without introducing himself. Jack never noticed. His attention rested on the faded black numbers painted near the rear section of the fuselage. They were original markings preserved during restoration rather than freshly painted replacements. Thomas followed Jack's gaze until his own eyes settled on the aircraft serial number. His expression slowly changed. The number seemed strangely familiar. He frowned and searched his memory. Decades of aviation history passed silently through his thoughts before one forgotten detail suddenly surfaced. Several years earlier he had studied archived records while helping identify surviving Vietnam-era helicopters for restoration projects. One aircraft had carried an unusual service history because it had completed an evacuation mission remembered by several surviving crew members. Thomas took one slow breath. Surely it could not be the same helicopter. He carefully walked toward the information stand positioned beside the display. A laminated restoration booklet rested beneath a clear protective cover. Thomas opened it and quietly turned several pages until he found the aircraft identification record. His eyes moved from the serial number printed on the page back to the helicopter itself. Then back again. The numbers matched perfectly. His heartbeat quickened. He looked over his shoulder toward Jack, who remained standing peacefully with one hand resting inside the pocket of his weathered field jacket. Thomas walked back toward him, stopping a respectful distance away. "Beautiful restoration," he said gently. Jack smiled without taking his eyes off the helicopter. "They did a remarkable job." Thomas nodded. "Most people notice the paint first." Jack's smile grew slightly warmer. "Pilots usually notice everything else." The words landed with quiet weight. Thomas studied the elderly veteran's face for a long moment before asking another careful question. "Have you flown one before?" Jack remained silent for several seconds. His eyes drifted once more toward the cabin doorway. "A long time ago," he answered softly. "Nothing more. No stories. No explanation. Just 5 simple words." Thomas felt a chill despite the warmth of the Montana morning. He looked again toward the serial number painted on the Huey, and then back to Jack. Pieces that had rested separately in his memory for years suddenly began fitting together with startling precision. Without another word, Thomas reached into his pocket, removed his cellular telephone, and stepped quietly away from the crowd. There was only one person he trusted to answer the question now forming in his mind, and if his suspicion proved correct, the elderly man standing quietly beside the helicopter had just been mistaken for an ordinary visitor when he might actually be the reason that very aircraft had become part of American military history. Thomas Mercer walked several yards away from the Huey before stopping beneath the shade of a tall cottonwood tree. The cheerful sounds of the memorial celebration faded behind him as he searched through the contacts stored in his cellular telephone. His thumb hesitated for only a moment before selecting the name of Colonel David Reynolds, the retired aviation officer who had supervised several military restoration projects across the western United States. The telephone rang twice before a calm voice answered. "David Reynolds speaking." Thomas kept his eyes fixed on the helicopter. "David, I need you to confirm something for me. I am standing beside the restored Huey displayed at the Billings Memorial event." "I remember that aircraft," the colonel replied. "What about it?" Thomas lowered his voice. "There is an elderly veteran here who looked at that helicopter the way only a pilot would. Then he stopped in front of the original serial number before I even noticed it." A brief silence followed. "Did he say his name?" the colonel asked. "Not at first. I asked whether he had ever flown one. And he only said a long time ago." The colonel remained quiet for another moment before asking, "Can you read me the serial number?" Thomas carefully repeated every digit exactly as it appeared on the restored aircraft. Papers rustled on the other end of the call. Several seconds passed before the colonel spoke again, his voice noticeably different. "That aircraft was involved in one of the best documented medical evacuation missions from that period. The pilot's reports were preserved because every passenger survived." Thomas felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Do you still have the pilot's name? More pages turned. Yes. Another pause. Jack Sullivan. Thomas slowly looked across the display area toward the quiet elderly man still standing peacefully beside the helicopter. Jack had not moved. He simply watched families admire the aircraft while children laughed nearby. There was nothing about him that suggested he expected recognition. Thomas spoke softly. He is here. The colonel immediately answered. Stay with him. Do not let him leave if he is willing to remain. I want to verify one more detail. What detail? Thomas asked. Ask him whether the aircraft still has the small repair plate beneath the left cockpit step. It was installed after one emergency landing during its service years. That repair was unique to that helicopter. Thomas thanked him and ended the call before walking calmly back toward Jack. The elderly veteran noticed him approaching and offered the same gentle smile. Did you find what you were looking for? Jack asked. Thomas glanced toward the left side of the Huey before looking back at him. May I ask you one unusual question? Jack nodded. Of course. Thomas pointed discreetly toward the lower section beneath the cockpit entrance. Would there happen to be a small repair plate hidden underneath that step? Jack looked toward the exact location without hesitation. A faint smile returned to his face, carrying memories far older than the polished helicopter standing before them. If the restoration team left it in place, he said quietly, you will find 4 original rivets holding it exactly where the crew chief installed it. Thomas slowly walked to the opposite side of the display, leaned carefully to look beneath the step, and felt his breath catch. 4 weathered rivets remained exactly where Jack had described them. The repair plate had survived every passing decade. Thomas closed his eyes for a brief moment before straightening again. There was no longer any room for doubt. The elderly man who had been politely turned away from climbing aboard was not simply another visitor. He was the pilot whose hands had once guided that very Huey through one of the most unforgettable missions in its long history. Thomas Mercer stood motionless beside the landing skid for several long seconds, his eyes fixed on the weathered repair plate hidden beneath the cockpit step. The 4 original rivets remained exactly where Jack Sullivan had said they would be, untouched through decades of careful restoration. No museum guide had mentioned them. No information board described them. They were details remembered only by someone who had once depended upon that aircraft as more than a historical artifact. Thomas slowly turned back toward Jack, whose calm expression had not changed. The elderly veteran simply watched another family pose for photographs beside the helicopter, never attempting to draw attention to himself. Thomas reached once again for his cellular telephone, and immediately called Colonel David Reynolds. The retired officer answered before the first ring had fully ended. Tell me, he said. Thomas spoke quietly, careful that no nearby visitors could overhear. The repair plate is there. 4 original rivets exactly where he described them. He knew before he even looked. A long silence followed. Then the colonel answered with unmistakable certainty. There is no doubt anymore. Computer keys clicked faintly in the background as David accessed the archived restoration files stored in his office. I have the complete preservation record in front of me, he continued. The restoration team documented every original marking they could verify. The aircraft serial number matches. The maintenance log matches. The repair beneath the left cockpit step matches. And the pilot assigned to that mission was Captain Jack Sullivan. Thomas glanced toward the quiet veteran again. He never mentioned any of it. That sounds exactly like him, David replied. Several men who served with him described him the same way. He never spoke about himself unless someone else needed to be remembered. Thomas lowered his voice even further. The young volunteer stopped him from stepping aboard earlier. Another pause settled across the line. He could not have known, David answered gently. But he deserves to know now. Thomas nodded even though the colonel could not see him. What should we do? David did not hesitate. I am already leaving. It will take me about 45 minutes to reach the memorial park. Until then, stay with Mr. Sullivan if he is comfortable remaining. Do not announce anything yet. Let us verify everything properly and honor him the right way. Understood. Thomas replied before ending the call. Across the display area, Ethan Brooks continued welcoming visitors with the same professionalism he had shown all morning. He noticed Thomas speaking with Jack more than once and wondered what had captured the retired pilot's attention. Curiosity slowly replaced confidence. Ethan walked toward them carrying a bottle of water. "Sir," he said respectfully to Jack, "it is getting warmer outside. Would you like some water?" Jack accepted it with a grateful smile. "Thank you. That is very kind." Ethan hesitated before speaking again. "Have you known Mr. Mercer for long?" Jack chuckled softly. "We met about 5 minutes ago." Thomas smiled. Sometimes 5 minutes is enough to discover that someone has been quietly carrying an extraordinary story for a lifetime. Ethan looked from one man to the other, uncertain what Thomas meant. Before he could ask another question, the distant sound of a vehicle entering the memorial grounds drew Thomas's attention toward the parking area. A dark sedan came to a slow stop near the administration building, and Colonel David Reynolds stepped out carrying a weathered leather portfolio tucked carefully beneath one arm. He did not walk toward the event organizers first. He did not stop to greet the guests of honor. The moment he spotted Jack Sullivan standing beside the Huey, his pace quickened, and the expression on his face revealed that he was not approaching an ordinary visitor, but someone whose place in the story of that aircraft had never truly been forgotten. Colonel David Reynolds crossed the memorial grounds with steady purpose, the worn leather portfolio tucked securely beneath his arm as conversations around the Huey gradually softened. Several organizers recognized him immediately and offered polite greetings, but he acknowledged them only with brief nods, never slowing his pace. His attention remained fixed on the elderly man standing quietly beside the helicopter. Jack Sullivan noticed the retired colonel approaching and offered the same calm smile he had given everyone else that morning. There was no expectation in his eyes, only quiet courtesy. David stopped a few feet away and looked at Jack for a long moment before extending his hand. "Captain Jack Sullivan," he said respectfully, "it is an honor to finally meet you." Jack accepted the handshake with gentle surprise. "It has been many years since anyone called me captain," he replied with a soft smile. "Most people simply call me Jack." David smiled back. "Some titles are earned for life." Thomas Mercer remained beside them while Ethan Brooks watched from the entrance to the exhibit, sensing that something important was unfolding. Visitors nearby also began noticing the unusual gathering around the helicopter. David carefully opened the leather portfolio and removed several preserved copies of military service records protected inside transparent sleeves. He never held them up for the crowd. Instead, he quietly showed them to Jack first. The older veteran glanced down at the familiar pages, recognizing his own name typed across documents that had not crossed his path in decades. He smiled almost nostalgically. "I have not seen these in a very long time," he said. David nodded. "Neither had I until this morning." He pointed toward one report. "The Restoration Archive preserved these records because they belong to this aircraft. Every maintenance entry, every assignment, every transfer. Your name appears exactly where it should." Jack looked from the documents to the Huey and then back again. "I always hoped she would survive," he said quietly. David followed his gaze toward the helicopter. "She did. And because she survived, so did the story connected to her." Ethan slowly walked closer, uncertainty replacing the confidence he had carried all morning. He hesitated before speaking. "Excuse me, Colonel. Is everything all right?" David turned toward the young volunteer with a reassuring expression. "Everything is more than all right." He gently closed the portfolio before continuing. "Earlier today you were protecting an important piece of military history." Ethan nodded. "Yes, sir." David smiled kindly. "You were also speaking to one of the men who helped create that history." Ethan looked at Jack in complete disbelief. His eyes drifted toward the helicopter, and then back again as the meaning of those words slowly settled over him. "Sir, I did not know," Jack immediately answered before anyone else could. There was no reason you should have known. His voice remained warm and free of blame. You treated both the helicopter and the visitors with respect. That is exactly what you were asked to do. Ethan lowered his eyes anyway. I still stopped you. Jack rested one hand gently against the young man's shoulder. You stopped a stranger. You did not disrespect a veteran. Those simple words eased the tension that had begun building around them. Nearby visitors sensed that something extraordinary was happening, and more people quietly gathered around the exhibit without speaking. No announcements had been made. No microphones had been turned on. Yet an unmistakable feeling of reverence settled across the memorial park. David looked toward the restored Huey once more before returning his attention to Jack. Captain, he said with quiet sincerity, there is something that should have happened the moment you arrived this morning, and with your permission, I would like to make it right. Jack studied the colonel's face for a moment before giving a gentle nod. Around them, the crowd instinctively fell silent, as though everyone present somehow understood that the next few moments would become part of the helicopter's story just as surely as the decades that had come before. Colonel David Reynolds stepped toward the entrance of the restored Huey before turning to face the small crowd that had gathered almost without realizing it. The conversations that had filled the memorial park only minutes earlier gradually faded until the only sounds were the gentle breeze moving through the cottonwood trees and the distant rustle of American flags lining the walkway. David rested one hand lightly on the open cabin door before looking back at Jack Sullivan. His voice carried clearly without ever becoming loud. Captain Sullivan, he said, this aircraft has welcomed thousands of visitors over the years, but today it should first welcome the man who once welcomed others home. Every eye turned toward the elderly veteran. Jack remained perfectly still for a moment, almost embarrassed by the unexpected attention. He glanced briefly toward Ethan Brooks, who instinctively stepped away from the entrance and gently unclipped the velvet barrier that had marked the display throughout the day. Ethan lowered his head slightly before speaking. Captain Sullivan, I would be honored if you would board her now. Jack looked at the young volunteer with the same kindness that had never left his expression. Thank you, son, he answered quietly. That means more than you know. Without applause or ceremony, Jack began walking toward the helicopter. Each measured step seemed to carry not only the weight of his years but also the quiet dignity of a life never spent asking for recognition. Families moved aside without being asked. Children instinctively became silent. Several veterans standing near the back of the gathering slowly removed their caps and held them over their hearts. Thomas Mercer watched with moist eyes, recognizing that everyone present was witnessing something far greater than a museum demonstration. Jack reached the landing skid and paused. For just a second he rested one hand against the familiar metal frame beside the cabin door. His fingertips lingered gently on the surface as though greeting an old friend after many decades apart. A faint smile crossed his face before he carefully placed one polished brown shoe onto the step. His movements were slow but confident, guided less by memory than by instinct that had never truly disappeared. As he entered the cabin, the sunlight streamed through the broad windows, illuminating rows of simple canvas seats restored with remarkable care. Jack's eyes traveled across every corner of the interior. The overhead structure, the side panels, the worn contours of the cockpit doorway. Nothing escaped his attention. He quietly reached out and brushed his fingertips across the back of one seat, then another, saying nothing for several long moments. Outside the helicopter, not a single visitor interrupted the silence. Even young children seemed to understand that words would only diminish what was unfolding before them. Ethan remained near the doorway, watching with growing respect as the elderly veteran absorbed every familiar detail. Jack finally turned toward the cockpit and slowly walked forward until he stood beside the pilot's seat. He rested one hand lightly on its edge and closed his eyes. His breathing became slower, steadier. There was no sadness on his face. Only gratitude. After a quiet moment he opened his eyes again and smiled softly. She still feels like home, he whispered. Thomas lowered his head. Colonel Reynolds quietly removed his own cap and held it respectfully against his chest. One by one, every veteran standing nearby followed his example. No command had been given. No announcement had been made. Respect moved through the gathering naturally, spreading from one person to the next until nearly everyone surrounding the helicopter stood silently with uncovered heads, honoring not only the man inside the cabin but also the countless memories that still lived within the aircraft itself. Jack remained beside the pilot's seat for another quiet moment before turning toward the cabin where the rows of restored canvas seats stretched behind him. He slowly ran his fingertips along the top of one seat back, then another, as though greeting old companions whose names only he could still remember. Outside the helicopter, no one spoke. Colonel David Reynolds, Thomas Mercer, Ethan Brooks, and every visitor nearby waited with patient respect. Finally, Jack looked toward the open cabin door and smiled gently. "People often ask what I remember most," he said in a calm voice that carried naturally through the still afternoon air. "Most expect me to remember the flying." He paused, glancing once more around the cabin. "The truth is, I remember the people." His eyes settled on the row of seats behind him. 10 young men sat right here on one unforgettable flight. He rested his hand lightly against the nearest seat. Some were exhausted. Some barely had enough strength to lift their heads. A few tried to thank us before we even left the ground. Jack smiled softly, not with pride but with gratitude. I kept telling them the same thing. Save your energy. We will talk when we get home. Ethan listened without moving, every word settling deeply in his mind. Jack continued, his voice steady and peaceful. When we landed safely, I watched every one of those young men walk away from this helicopter. Some needed help. Some leaned on friends. Some simply stood still for a long time before looking up at the sky. He looked through the open doorway toward the families gathered outside. Years later I realized I had never counted missions. I counted homecomings. A quiet breeze drifted through the open cabin, gently stirring the edge of Jack's old field jacket. He smiled as another memory surfaced. Several years after the war, one of those men found me. He brought photographs of his family. His children. His grandchildren. He thanked me for bringing him home. Jack slowly shook his head. I told him he owed me nothing. The greatest reward had already happened the day I watched him step off this helicopter under his own strength. Thomas Mercer quietly wiped away a tear before lowering his gaze. Colonel Reynolds stood perfectly still, holding his cap against his chest. Around them, visitors listened with complete attention. There were no dramatic stories. No heroic speeches. Only simple memories shared by a man who had never believed they belonged to him alone. Jack looked once more around the cabin before speaking again. Machines grow old. Paint fades. Metal wears with time. But every empty seat inside this helicopter reminds me of someone who had another birthday, another Thanksgiving, another Christmas with family. His smile grew warmer. That is what I remember whenever I see her. Ethan felt his throat tighten. Earlier that morning he had seen only a restored aircraft and an elderly visitor standing too close to the display. Now he understood that every inch of the cabin carried memories that could never be placed on an information sign. Jack gently rested his hand on the pilot's seat one final time before turning back toward the doorway. I have always believed that history is not measured by the machines we preserve, he said quietly. It is measured by the lives that continued because ordinary people chose to do their jobs with all their hearts. As the last words faded into the peaceful afternoon, the silence surrounding the Huey became even more meaningful, because everyone standing outside understood they were no longer looking at a museum exhibit. They were looking at a place where countless futures had quietly begun again. Jack Sullivan stepped carefully out of the Huey, his polished shoes touching the landing skid before he slowly returned to the ground. For a brief moment he rested one hand against the doorframe, offering the helicopter one final silent farewell. The afternoon sun bathed the memorial park in a warm golden light, and the gentle breeze carried the sound of fluttering American flags across the gathering. No one rushed to speak. The silence itself had become the highest form of respect. Colonel David Reynolds took one step forward and stood at attention. Without a single command being spoken, Thomas Mercer followed. Then another veteran did the same. Within seconds, every former service member surrounding the exhibit stood straight and raised a respectful salute toward Jack. Families quietly watched as husbands, wives, sons, daughters, and grandchildren witnessed a tradition that required no explanation. Jack looked at the line of veterans before him and slowly returned the salute, his movements steady despite the passing decades. His eyes reflected gratitude rather than pride. The gesture lasted only a few seconds, yet it carried a lifetime of shared understanding. When both hands lowered once again, Ethan Brooks walked forward with visible emotion. His confident voice from earlier that morning had disappeared, replaced by genuine humility. "Captain Sullivan," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Jack smiled before Ethan could continue. "No, son," he answered gently. "You owe me nothing." Ethan shook his head. "I stopped you from boarding your own helicopter." Jack looked back at the Huey and chuckled softly. "It has never belonged to me." He turned toward the young volunteer again. "It belongs to everyone who remembers why it mattered." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment before extending his hand. Jack accepted it warmly, but instead of letting go immediately, he gave the young man's shoulder a reassuring pat. "You protected it because you cared," Jack said. "Never apologize for caring. Just remember that sometimes history does not arrive wearing medals." Those words settled deeply over everyone standing nearby. The photographer who had captured the first encounter quietly lifted his camera one last time. This photograph was different from the first. The earlier image had shown an elderly veteran being stopped at the doorway of a helicopter. This one captured a young volunteer and an old pilot standing side by side, united not by embarrassment but by mutual respect. Colonel Reynolds carefully closed the leather portfolio containing Jack's service records before offering it to him. Jack smiled and gently pushed it back. "Keep those with the aircraft," he said. "If someone comes here years from now and wonders why this helicopter mattered, they should be able to find the answer." David nodded with quiet understanding. "We will make certain they do." As the afternoon drew to a close, families slowly resumed walking through the memorial displays, but something had changed. Parents paused longer while reading the historical signs. Children looked at the Huey with new curiosity. Veterans lingered beside the helicopter with thoughtful expressions, knowing they had witnessed a moment that could never be recreated. Jack took one final look at the aircraft before turning toward the park entrance. He did not look back again. He had already carried those memories for more than half a century, and now they belonged to others as well. Behind him, the restored Huey rested peacefully beneath the Montana sky, no longer remembered simply as a remarkable aircraft but as a quiet reminder that the greatest acts of service are often carried by the humblest people, and that true honor does not ask to be recognized because it has already fulfilled its purpose. Some people leave behind monuments of stone, while others leave behind lives that continued because they chose duty over recognition, and those legacies never fade.